Hi there, welcome to the channel. Central banks are printing money like never before. The Biden administration has just approved a $1.9 trillion stimulus in its latest package, and quantitative easing has been going on for years now. Interest rates are the lowest they've ever been, and in the UK, inflation, although it's just ticked up above the 2% target, by any measure, the global monetary policy is the most slack that it's ever been, but inflation is still at historical low levels. What on earth is going on? Well, in this video, we'll find out. I'm Anthony, and as always, we're talking money. One fairly accepted train of thought goes that to have optimal economic growth, you need low and stable inflation, which is why governments and central banks pay so much attention to it. The Bank of England has a target of 2% and has to explain itself if it goes above this rate. Politicians too are sensitive to inflation, as the electorate are more likely to vote for them if the public are in a job and are economically satisfied. Also, a successful economy means that more taxes can be paid for politically sensitive items like schools and hospitals, and therefore increased likelihood of those politicians being re-elected. Inflation is essentially rising prices, and prices rise in an economy because typically demand exceeds supply. The change in price is a market's way of matching the demand to the supply. Now, the more interesting question is what changes the supply and demand in an economy, and what role does money play in the system? Early thinkers disseminated supply and demand down to just the supply of money, i.e. how much money was actually in the system, and any change in the amount of money resulted in changes in demand and supply. You know this is probably true if you have lots of money in your bank account, say you've just won the national lottery for example, you're more willing to pay for an item, say on eBay, than if you didn't have much money in your bank account. If that item on eBay, say, is a scarce item and other people have lots of money too, in this scenario the price is inevitably going to be higher than if a product was plentiful and you were cash strapped. Transfer this onto a national scale or even onto a global scale, prices should be rising fast, very fast. But in the UK, April's inflation figure showed a slight dip, while May's, the latest figure, showed a slight jump to just 2.1%, a very far cry from the 28% we had in the 1970s. So perhaps there isn't much money around, or maybe the basket of goods used for the inflation calculation are not that scarce. Maybe there's a glut of products where producers are willing to accept lower profits just to shift their stock. Early thinkers like David Hume, the philosopher in the 18th century, only considered the growth of money in the system, or money stock as he called it, supplied by the government to be the main or only cause of inflation. But in reality, that money actually has to be spent. Simply stuffing more money in the mattress or in the bank account won't result in any change to demand, or therefore inflation. A measure of how fast or how much money is actually being spent rather than tucked away is called the velocity of money, and it's the number of times a pound or a dollar is spent to buy goods and services over a period of time. So at least two things need to be present for inflation to occur: growth of money stock and a change in velocity, and neither will result in a change of inflation overnight, so you also need time as well. But not surprisingly, it isn't quite as simple as that. With economics, it never is. One other factor needs to be considered, and that's GDP, or how big the economy is to start with. A government like the UK's is not going to have any material effect on inflation if it issues just a few extra pounds because of the size of the economy. So these things need to be taken into context with GDP. Now, without going into rather boring maths, you may have to take my word for this, always a dangerous thing to do, when I say the measuring of the velocity of money is actually a very difficult thing to do, except to say that after some very clever people did some sums, the velocity can be determined by dividing nominal GDP, which is the sum of prices of all the goods and services in the economy, by the quantity of money in the system. Now, bear with me here a little bit. If velocity is constant, then money growth is equal to GDP plus inflation. Or put it another way round, a change in prices or inflation is equal to the change in money minus the change in GDP. The summary to this is a little bit mathematical, and it's if you change money supply at the same rate as the change in GDP and the velocity of money stays the same, then you won't or shouldn't get any inflation. The takeaway point in this is that inflation is directly proportional to money growth, and this theory is called the quantity theory of money. This leads us to the famous quote by Milton Friedman, who said that inflation is always a monetary phenomenon. So it would stand to reason that governments that increase the money stock should see a rise in inflation. Since 2008, America alone has pumped in tens of trillions of dollars into the system, yet inflation has remained benign. So the only other variable is our dear friend velocity, and here's the graph of what's happened to the velocity of money since 1980. From the peak in 1983, the velocity of money has been pretty much on a constant decrease, decreasing from the financial crisis in 2008, and although not in the graph, the coronavirus has suppressed it even more. People really have been stuffing their money into their metaphorical mattresses. This graph amply demonstrates that the governments have had to increase money stock into the system to counteract the reduced velocity of money. If they hadn't, then inflation would probably have turned negative and economies would have gone into a long, deep recession as populations would have ceased spending altogether, even resulting in a spiralling slump in demand, which is more or less exactly what happened in Japan in their deflationary cycle. Now, what's to happen next, I hear you say? Well, all eyes are on what happens to GDP and this velocity of money, because you can see that if the money taps are kept open, velocity of money increases and GDP growth can't keep up, then inflation will bite very hard indeed. Now, on first reflection, you may well think that now that the economy is opening up after the worst of the pandemic, it seems blindingly obvious that the velocity of money will start to increase and may increase quite rapidly. Yet the Federal Reserve in America and the Bank of England here is still pumping money into the system. And if you're worried about inflation, then seeing that Chinese factory gate prices are going up by 9%, and in America they've just seen a hike to 5% in consumer prices, the highest since the financial crisis. But interestingly, both the Federal Reserve and the inflation-sensitive bond markets are both judging that this is just a temporary blip and nothing much to worry about. So what's going on? Well, you may have to delve a little bit deeper into how these inflation figures are compiled. Strip out the top products that are increasing the most and the least, and you get a rate of just 2.6% in America. The median rate in the same basket only rose by 2.1%, which is a lot less scary than the 5% headline figure. It looks like just a few products are perhaps skewing the figures to make them look a lot scarier. Wages too are anecdotally rising quickly as companies struggle to find workers. Think restaurants, bars and some agricultural sectors that just can't find staff, so have to jack up the pay to attract more entrants. However, in aggregate, America still has 10 million more people unemployed compared to before the pandemic, and once our furlough scheme comes to an end, we too may well find that unemployment climbs, leaving more workers chasing jobs. Any increase in spending or increase in velocity of money is not guaranteed. If job security remains an issue or the virus escapes our vaccines, then turning the money taps off too early will cause the recessionary slump that Boris and Biden so desperately want to avoid. Have we been here before though? Are there any lessons we can learn from history? Certainly it's not unique. When people worry about inflation, they look no further than the 1970s, when inflation in the UK was up to about 28%. In that instance, it was precipitated by soaring oil prices. Companies' costs rose substantially while the pound in your pocket decreased in value. As a result, unions demanded pay rises to match. This was called a supply shock because it was a supplier of goods that faced an unavoidable increase in costs. Today, however, it's not the suppliers of goods that have caused the potential problem, but rather you and me going out en masse and spending all our savings that have accumulated over the last 18 months. For good reason, this is called a demand shock, and the two scenarios are very different indeed. The Fed and the Bank of England are both expecting inflation to peak soon and then settle back towards the 2% target, and in doing so, they expect interest rates to be kept low until about 2023. This is without doubt a big gamble, especially when you consider that the time lag between policy change and actual changes in the economy can be quite a long time, several months if not a year. Trying to correct a mistake later could lead to big changes in monetary policy. Think of this like steering a boat, little changes to keep it on track, but just as you're about to hit the rocks, you swing the wheel or tiller violently one way or another. Why does all this matter? Well, as with the mistakes made in the 1970s, there is a very heavy price to be paid by the general population during times of high inflation, and governments are rarely forgiven for it. Gerald Ford was dogged by inflation in his one term, as was Edward Heath, but also didn't survive more than one term. Also, think what happens to your own behaviour when you think inflation is going to increase substantially. You're probably more likely to spend what money you've got now, knowing that the pound in your pocket is going to be worth less in 6 months or a year or 2 years' time. In times of low inflation, you're more likely to maybe put off spending decisions to 6 months' time or so, because you know that the pound or the dollar is going to be worth roughly the same in a few months' time as it is today. And this may be one reason why the velocity of money decreases in line with inflation itself. One actually is causing the other. So as inflation ticks up, so too should the velocity of money. Anyway, I appreciate that this is a rather simplified view of how inflation takes effect, but as you can imagine, economics very quickly descends into fairly heavy maths, which nobody really wants to see when relaxing on YouTube. So please forgive me if my overview misses out all the steps and other inputs that may lead it to inflationary pressures. Economic modelling for inflation occupies the time of professors and scholars, but I hope you've enjoyed this video, and if you have, then hit that like button and subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. We're often discussing investing and money related themes. I'll catch you in the next video, but until then, I'm Anthony, and as always, we're talking money. Bye for now.